Look in a mirror tonight. If dark brown eyes look back at you, you're looking at something older than the pyramids, older than the first city ever built, older than written language itself. Those eyes did not begin with you, or with your mother, or with her mother before that. They crossed oceans. They survived ice ages, droughts, and the rise and fall of empires. And modern DNA science has finally traced exactly where they came from. And the answer is bigger than any single group of people. It belongs to almost all of us. Over the next several minutes, we're going to walk through what science actually understands about dark brown eyes. We're going to follow the genes, follow the fossils, follow the migration paths of the very first humans, and go all the way back to the birthplace of our species. By the end, you're going to look at your own reflection differently, no matter what continent your family calls home. Let's start with the basic question. What actually gives eyes their color? The answer sits inside a small ring of colored tissue called the iris, the part of your eye that surrounds the pupil. Inside the iris are specialized cells, and inside those cells is a pigment called melanin, the same substance responsible for the color of your skin and hair. There are two main types the human body produces. One is called eumelanin, which is dark and absorbs light. The other is called pheomelanin, which is lighter and more reddish. The mix and amount of these two pigments in your iris is what decides your eye color. Dark brown eyes carry a very high concentration of eumelanin. The more of it packed into the iris, the darker the brown appears. When light enters the eye, the eumelanin soaks up almost all of it, so very little bounces back out, which is why dark brown eyes look so deep and so rich. They hold light rather than reflect it, which happens to make them especially well suited to a world with strong, unfiltered sun, the exact kind of world our species first evolved in. For a long time, scientists taught eye color as a simple story. One gene from your mother, one from your father, brown dominant, blue recessive, end of discussion. That's what most of us learned in school, but modern genetics has shown that picture was far too simple. Eye color actually comes from a whole chain of genes working together, and two of them carry most of the weight. They're called OCA2 and HERC2. The OCA2 gene sits on chromosome 15 and carries the instructions for producing a protein involved in making melanin. When OCA2 runs at full strength, the body produces large amounts of eumelanin, which fills the iris and produces the deep brown color that the majority of people on this planet share. Brown eyes are not rare. They're not exotic. They are, by a wide margin, the default human setting, the color roughly 7 out of every 10 people on Earth see the world through, and among that majority, dark brown is the oldest and most widely shared shade of all. But OCA2 doesn't work alone. Sitting right next to it on the same chromosome is a second gene, HERC2, which scientists describe as a regulator. It doesn't produce pigment itself. Instead, it controls how active OCA2 is allowed to be. Picture OCA2 as a workshop producing dark pigment, and HERC2 as the master switch mounted on the wall outside it. When that switch is fully on, the workshop runs at full output, pigment fills the iris, and you get dark brown eyes. This is the system every single human ancestor carried for hundreds of thousands of years. It was the only setting there was. Then something rare happened. Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, in a region near what we now call the Black Sea, a single person was born with a small mutation in their HERC2 gene. A tiny change that turned that master switch down rather than fully off. That meant the OCA2 workshop next door produced less pigment than usual. The iris of that child filled with less eumelanin, and when light struck that thinner layer of pigment, some of it scattered instead of being absorbed. That scattering is what made the iris appear blue. There's no actual blue pigment involved anywhere in the human eye. Blue eyes are an optical effect, an absence rather than a presence, exactly what happens when the dark pigment drops low enough for light to bend and scatter differently on its way out. That single mutation, in that one ancestor near the Black Sea, is the genetic root of every blue-eyed person alive today. Every blue-eyed child born anywhere in the world traces back to that same shared origin point, a change that appeared less than 10,000 years ago, which in evolutionary terms is barely a blink. Think about what that actually means. Before that mutation ever appeared, the entire human race had brown eyes, full stop. Every person who built the first villages, painted on the first cave walls, or first learned to control fire, looked out at the world through eyes the color of rich soil, dark wood, or polished stone. Dark brown wasn't just common back then, it was universal. It was simply what a human eye was. The blue-eyed mutation is the rare exception, the newcomer. Dark brown eyes are the original. The deep foundation every other eye color on the planet was eventually built on top of. When scientists sequence ancient DNA pulled from skeletons tens of thousands of years old, the same genetic markers for dark brown eyes show up again and again in the bones of the earliest modern humans in Africa, in Ice Age cave dwellers across Europe, in the earliest people who crossed into the Americas. The signature doesn't change. Dark pigment, deep color. the ancestral form, over and over, across every continent our species ever reached. That's what makes dark brown eyes so remarkable. They aren't just a color, they're a record, a direct genetic thread connecting every person alive today back to the very first modern humans who ever existed. A child born this year with dark brown eyes is expressing the exact same genetic code that lit up the eyes of people who lived 300,000 years ago. Nothing about it has been lost. The original setting is still running. And science can now point, with real confidence, to exactly where that original setting first appeared. It's Africa. Not as a vague idea or a poetic flourish, but as a fact traced through genome after genome, fossil after fossil, across decades of research. Every modern human alive, regardless of what continent they were born on, what language they speak, or what their skin looks like, can trace their ancestry back to that continent. And the eyes those first ancestors carried were dark brown. The story starts roughly 300,000 years ago, the current best estimate for when Homo sapiens first appeared as a species. The earliest known fossils of anatomically modern humans come from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, in North Africa. Their skulls already show the features we'd recognize today: a taller forehead, a smaller jaw, the general shape of a modern human head. Genetic evidence pulled from much later remains in the same broader lineage shows those early humans had dark skin, dark hair, and dark brown eyes, all of it adapted to intense equatorial sun. Dark pigment wasn't decoration, it was protection, shielding skin from ultraviolet radiation and eyes from glare, built for the exact environment our species began in. For most of human history, Africa is the only place our species lived, somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 years, depending on which estimate you use. Generations rose and fell there. Stone tools became more refined. Symbolic thought and art appeared. At sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found humans grinding pigment, drilling shell beads, and engraving patterns into stone tens of thousands of years before anything similar shows up elsewhere on Earth. The first sophisticated human culture we have evidence for was African culture. The first eyes that looked up and wondered about the stars were dark brown. Then, somewhere between 60 and 70,000 years ago, a small group of these humans left Africa. Nobody knows the exact number, but genetic studies suggest the founding population may have been just a few thousand people, a small seed, carrying the entire human genetic toolkit with it, dark brown eyes included. They moved north, crossed into the Sinai, reached the Levant, and from there spread outward in every direction. Some moved east along the southern coast of Asia, eventually reaching India, Southeast Asia, and Australia by around 50,000 years ago. Others pushed north into Central Asia and eventually into Europe. Much later, other groups crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Every single one of these migrations began with people carrying dark brown eyes. Ancient DNA backs this up without much ambiguity. Skeletons pulled from European caves dating back 30 or 40,000 years carry the same genetic markers for dark brown eyes. One of the most famous examples is Cheddar Man, remains found in a cave in England dating back roughly 10,000 years. When researchers reconstructed his likely appearance from his DNA, they found dark skin, dark curly hair, and eyes that the genetic evidence pointed to as pale blue or green. A combination that actually surprised scientists, since it meant the light eye mutation had already started spreading in some European lineages by that point. But the earliest people to arrive in Europe, long before Cheddar Man, carried dark skin and dark brown eyes. The pale skin many people associate with Europeans today evolved much later, really only over the last 5 to 10,000 years, as populations adapted to weaker sunlight at higher latitudes. In other words, the picture most of us grew up with of ancient Europe as a place of pale-skinned, light-eyed people isn't accurate. The first people to walk into that continent were dark-skinned and dark-eyed. They carried African pigmentation with them the whole way. Light eyes and light skin are the recent edit, dark brown eyes are the original text. This is the part the DNA has made unmistakably clear, the shared root underneath every branch of the human family tree. If you have dark brown eyes today, you are carrying an unbroken genetic thread back to that original African source, not as a metaphor, but as literal inheritance, passed from parent to child for more than 300,000 years, all the way down to you. When geneticists study diversity across human DNA worldwide, they find something striking. The greatest genetic diversity on the planet isn't in Europe, Asia, or the Americas. It's in Africa, and the reason is simple. Humans have lived there the longest. The deeper a population's roots go in one place, the more time its DNA has had to branch and vary. Some African populations are more genetically different from each other than a Swedish person is from a Korean person. Two neighboring communities within a single African country can hold more genetic diversity between them than exists across entire continents elsewhere. This is what scientists mean when they say all humans descend from Africa. It isn't just the point of origin, it remains the deepest reservoir of human genetic history that exists anywhere on Earth. In 1987, researchers studying mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed only from mother to child without mixing with the fathers, made one of the most famous discoveries in modern genetics. By comparing mitochondrial DNA from people across the globe, they traced every living human female lineage back to a single common ancestor, a woman who lived in Africa somewhere between 150 and 200,000 years ago. Researchers named her Mitochondrial Eve. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time, and she wasn't the first woman ever. She's simply the most recent common ancestor whose mitochondrial DNA every living human, regardless of where their family lives today, still carries. Based on the available evidence, she almost certainly had dark skin and dark brown eyes. A parallel trail runs through the Y chromosome, passed only from father to son. The most recent common male ancestor of all living men, sometimes called a Y chromosomal Adam, also lived in Africa, with estimates placing him somewhere between 150 and 300,000 years ago. He too would have had dark skin and dark brown eyes. Both of humanity's deepest genetic lines, the maternal and the paternal, lead back to the same continent and to people who looked the way our earliest ancestors looked. Within Africa itself, the oldest surviving genetic lineages belong to groups like the San people of southern Africa and certain East African populations, whose mitochondrial DNA branches off earliest of anyone alive. These are the closest living genetic link to the most ancient human populations that ever existed, communities whose ancestors were already established in Africa, when the small founding group that became every non-African population on Earth walked out and disappeared over the horizon. Some studies estimate that roughly 7 or 8 out of every 10 people alive today carry the genetic markers for dark brown eyes. That makes dark brown the overwhelming global majority. Blue, green, and hazel eyes together account for only a small fraction of humanity, despite how often they're presented in advertising and film as some kind of default standard. The actual human standard is brown, and the oldest, most widespread form of it is dark brown. In scientific literature, this is sometimes described as the ancestral phenotype, meaning it's the original physical expression of these genes, the setting everything else is a variation on. That original form is still here, carried in most of the irises on the planet, passed down through more than 10,000 generations, older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than any written word. Within that shared human story, Africa's own history deserves to be told honestly because it rarely is. The Nile Valley gave rise to ancient Kemet, the name its own people used, the civilization the world later came to call Egypt, one that outlasted nearly every empire that followed it. The pharaohs, the engineers, the astronomers, and physicians who built that world were African, their features preserved in tomb paintings, statues, and mummified remains, their eyes rimmed in heavy black coal and artwork that leaves little doubt about their color. South of Egypt rose the kingdom of Kush, centered in modern Sudan, powerful enough that its kings ruled Egypt itself for nearly a century as the 25th dynasty. The pyramids of Meroe and Nuri, more numerous than Egypt's own, though smaller, still stand in the Sudanese desert today. Further west, the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai rose along the great bend of the Niger River, and Timbuktu became a genuine center of learning, where manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law were copied and studied for centuries. Mansa Musa, who ruled Mali in the 14th century, is often cited as the wealthiest individual in recorded history, his pilgrimage to Mecca carrying so much gold through Cairo that it disrupted the regional economy for years. Further south and central, the Bantu expansion carried language, ironworking, and agriculture from the borders of modern Cameroon and Nigeria all the way to the continent's southern tip over thousands of years. The Kingdom of Congo rose along the Atlantic coast. Great Zimbabwe's massive stone walls, built without mortar by craftsmen whose individual names had been lost to time, still stand today. The Swahili coast connected African traders with merchants from Arabia, India, and China centuries before European ships ever arrived. The Kingdom of Aksum, in what's now Ethiopia, became one of the first kingdoms anywhere in the world to formally adopt Christianity, and its towering stone obelisks still rise from the highland soil. Every one of these civilizations was built, led, and populated by people carrying dark skin and dark brown eyes. Then came centuries of forced migration that scattered African people across the globe. The transatlantic slave trade tore millions from their homes and forced them into the Americas and the Caribbean. Trade routes across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean displaced millions more toward North Africa and the Middle East. Today, descendants of those forcibly displaced peoples live in nearly every country on Earth, in Brazil, the United States, Jamaica, Colombia, the United Kingdom, France, and far beyond. The genetic markers for dark brown eyes traveled with every one of them, carried forward through everything that history tried to break. The chain never actually broke. In recent years, DNA ancestry testing has let millions of people in the African diaspora trace their genetic roots back to specific regions across the continent: Senegal, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, entire homelands taken by force now being partially recovered through science. For many people, that recovery is deeply emotional. Not just data on a screen, but a thread reconnecting a family to a specific place it was violently separated from generations ago. A grandmother in Iran and a child in Lagos all have dark brown eyes. They're all expressing the exact same ancestral genetic setting, one that traces back to the same starting point in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. Dark brown eyes are, in a very real sense, one of the last shared physical inheritances, connecting nearly the entire human species back to a single origin, regardless of how far any particular branch of the family tree eventually traveled, or how much the environment along the way reshaped skin tone, hair texture, or facial structure in response to local climates. That shared inheritance is exactly what makes looking into a mirror and seeing dark brown eyes so significant. You aren't looking at a random cosmetic feature. You're looking at continuity, arguably the longest unbroken thread running through your entire body. Nearly everything else about human populations has shifted and adapted as different groups spread into different climates over tens of thousands of years. But the deep pigment sitting in most human irises has stayed remarkably consistent since the very beginning of our species. Culturally, dark brown eyes have been described across languages and centuries in strikingly similar terms, compared to rich earth, dark wood, deep rivers, and night skies just before dawn. They've been called the eyes of mothers and grandmothers. Eyes that have watched empires rise and fall and simply kept watching. That kind of imagery shows up again and again across unrelated storytelling traditions worldwide, likely because this eye color has been part of the human story for so long that it quietly shaped how humans everywhere came to describe warmth, depth, and beauty in the first place. Modern advertising and film have often marketed lighter eyes as some kind of default standard of beauty. But that's a commercial trend from the last century or two, not a reflection of biological reality. The actual scientific reality is that dark brown eyes are the foundational human form, the one nearly every other eye color on the planet is a variation of. There's a quiet kind of power in understanding that, knowing that the deep brown you see in the mirror isn't a deviation from some other, more standard version of a human eye. It is the standard, the very starting point every other shade eventually branched off from, the original pigment that once protected the first humans from the African sun, and has remained the most common eye color on the planet in every generation since. Every dark brown iris alive today is a quiet piece of evidence that the line stretching back 300,000 years to Africa never actually broke. Not through ice ages, not through famine or plague, not through empires rising and collapsing, not through the long centuries of forced migration, and not through anything else history has thrown at the billions of people who carry these eyes. So tonight, when you look into a mirror and see those dark brown eyes again, remember what you're actually looking at. You're looking at the oldest design in the entire human catalog, the same pigment expression that lit up the eyes of the very first humans who ever watched a sunrise. You're looking at a trait that connects you to nearly every population on Earth, no matter how far any particular branch of the family eventually wandered from that first starting point in Africa. It's a record written in biology rather than words, and it's still being passed down, quietly, generation after generation, exactly as it always has been. It's worth sitting with how strange it is that something this fundamental took modern science this long to fully map out. For most of human history, nobody had any way of knowing where their eye color actually came from, beyond looking at their own parents and grandparents. Ancestry was passed down through stories, through family memory, through whatever fragments survived migration and displacement. DNA sequencing changed that completely, giving researchers a way to read the actual instructions sitting inside every living cell and trace them backward across hundreds of thousands of years, with a level of precision no oral tradition could ever match on its own. That's part of why discoveries like mitochondrial Eve, Y-chromosomal Adam, and the ancestral mapping of eye pigmentation genes landed with such force when they were first published. They weren't just academic curiosities. They gave millions of people, especially those whose family histories had been disrupted or erased by forced migration, an actual scientific method for reconnecting with a lineage that colonization and displacement had tried to sever. That's also why this story keeps resurfacing in new forms as sequencing technology gets cheaper and more widely available. Every year, researchers pull fresh genetic data from newly analyzed ancient remains, refine the estimated dates for key mutations like the one behind blue eyes, and sharpen the picture of exactly how and when different populations spread out from that original African starting point. The core outline has held remarkably steady for decades now. Modern humans emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, carried dark skin and dark brown eyes as the default form for the overwhelming majority of that time, and only much later, as small groups settled into environments with far less sunlight, did lighter variations begin to appear and spread through some populations. Everything discovered since has mostly added detail and precision to that outline, rather than overturning it. What hasn't changed, and what the genetics keep confirming again and again, is that this particular story belongs to almost everyone. It doesn't divide neatly along the lines modern society tends to draw. It runs straight through nearly every population on every continent, connecting people who share almost no cultural history, no shared language, and no direct contact with each other, all the way back to the same handful of ancestors standing on the same continent hundreds of thousands of years ago. That's the part worth remembering the next time you catch your own reflection. The eyes looking back at you are older than any nation, older than any border, and older than any of the categories humans have since invented to sort each other into groups. They're simply, quietly, original.